That's kind of the best I can. Okay, but it means the exact same thing in Hebrew in the Old Testament. It means to put your face to the ground. Now, I'm going to say something to you, might kind of shock you. I think it would be good if we literally did this at least once a week. If we literally bowed down before God, laid our burdens down, and admitted to Him, I can't do it without you. Now, I like to get on my knees and worship. Lots of times I get on my knees and worship. I like to do that. It is amazing how Satan doesn't want you to do that. It's amazing how, if you remember when Satan tempted Jesus, he didn't just say, if you'll worship me, he said, if you'll bow down and worship me, if you will prostrate yourself, if you'll put your face to the ground in front of me. And obviously Jesus didn't. But it's amazing how when you begin to learn to express your worship, you need to remember, folks, when the worship team up here, they're called the worship team, not the song team. They're not leading us in songs, they're leading us in worship. Isn't it amazing how many times we go through a worship service and don't worship? How we get distracted and we're thinking about something else that we need to be doing and we miss worshiping God. Listen to me, we need to come into His presence. And I can remember when I first started learning to lift my hands to Him. And lifting hands is all through the Scripture. Your children lift their hands to you. Your grandchildren lift their hands to you. How come all of a sudden we can't lift our hands to God in church? And I remember when I first began to really enter into worship, I can remember how Satan would attack me, you know. I'd start to lift my hands and he would say, now, you know, you met those visitors before the service. And if you lift your hands, you're going to scare them off. And so I can remember one time wanting to kneel down. And I had some relatives with me. Now, we grew up in a church that we didn't do that, you know. And I remember I just felt like I want to get on my knees. And you know, you've probably had this. Here's what you think. They're going to think you're crazy. They're going to think you're crazy. And I remember thinking, well, I'm just going to do it anyway. And so I got down like this, and I just bowed down. I thought, I'm just going to just bow down like this. And as I bowed down, this thought went through my mind. Your underwear is showing. What I'm saying to you is God has called us to go out, but we can't go out until we come in. Don't be afraid of worshiping Jesus. It's the best thing you can do. It brings the presence of the Lord. Here's the second thing. Worship brings God's fear in our lives. Now, I know we have a lot of people that don't understand the fear of God. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. It talks about an awe, an honor, a respect of God. But I want to show you a part of the fear of God that a lot of people miss. Verse 12 says, Saul was afraid of David. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him and had departed from Saul. Verse 15, therefore, when Saul saw that he behaved very wisely, he was afraid of him. You know why he was afraid of him? Because God had departed from him. But you have to remember, at this time, Saul represents David's enemy. Matter of fact, the Spirit of the Lord had not only left him, but an evil spirit had come on Saul. But do you remember, just think about this. Do you remember what they did to get the evil spirit off of Saul? David brought his heart and worshiped. And it drove the evil spirit away. I mean, if you got any problem with any bondage in your life, here it is. Get in the presence of God through worship. But he was afraid of him. Why? Because the enemy was controlling Saul at this time. I'm telling you, the enemy is afraid of Jesus. He's not afraid of you. He's afraid of you with Jesus. He's afraid of Jesus with you. Have you ever seen in a movie or a TV show, there'll be maybe like kind of a small guy, kind of scrawny, you know, and these 3 or 4 guys will come and they're going to bully him. And they're going to pick on him and they maybe kind of grab his coat like this, and they're just about to whoop up on him, you know. And then the scrawny guy normally has a good friend who's like real big, you know. And the good friend will walk up, you know, kind of behind and say, well, what's going on here? And they say, oh, nothing. We're just straightening his coat, you know. And the bullies run away. You ever seen a scene like that? Okay. That's exactly what it's like when the enemy comes to whoop up on you and Jesus walks up. I'm telling you, he will leave. I promise you, the best thing you can do this year is spend time with God. Get in God's presence. Come in to his presence so that when you go out with him, and the fear of God comes on all of your enemies. And I'm not talking about people. We don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. The fear of God comes on the enemy when the presence of God is on you. Now here's the third thing. Worship brings God's wisdom in our lives. Worship brings God's wisdom in our lives. Verse 14 says, and David behaved wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. You ever needed God's wisdom? You ever had a situation in your home or with one of your kids where you needed the wisdom of God? You ever had a situation in business where you needed the wisdom of God? It's the presence of God that brings the wisdom of God. Solomon says, I don't know how to do this. My dad was great at this. My dad understood worship and warfare. He understood this. If I could just understand this, then I could be the leader that you want me to be, God. And so God said, well, because you asked for this, and not for riches or honor or fame, I'm going to give you those things too, and I'm going to give you wisdom. God's presence brings the wisdom of God. Think about it this way. Who was the wisest man that ever lived? Solomon. And we know why. Because he said to God, I don't know how to do these two things. If you'll help me do these two things. Think about this. I'm very simple. You know that. The number one comment I hear from people is, our children like to listen to you. It's because we're on the same level. I am not a smart person. I know I'm not. If you think I am, you're wrong. I'm not smart, but I am wise. And I'm wise because I know God. I know how to come into his presence and meet with God and go out empowered with his presence. Wisdom comes from the presence of God. Let me read you a passage about Solomon's wisdom. 2 Chronicles 9 verse 1 says, now when the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon, she came to Jerusalem to test Solomon with hard questions, having a very great retinue, camels that bore spices, gold in abundance, and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. So Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing so difficult for Solomon that he could not explain it to her. Obviously, that's the wisdom of God. And when the queen of Sheba had seen the wisdom of Solomon, now watch this list, the house that he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his servants, in other words, she saw the organization of God in his life also, the service of his waiters and their apparel, his cupbearers and their apparel, now watch this last part, and his entryway. That word entryway in the Hebrew means upper room. His entryway by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. Say it another way, there was no more argument. There was no more suspicion. See, she came very suspicious. Here's the reason why. At that time, the queen of Sheba was reputed to be the wealthiest queen in the world.